my pleasure and privilege to officially welcome you to the 4th Annual Jewish Futures Conference, brought to you by the Jewish Education Project and Jesna. The issue that brings us together today is at the very core, the very heart of the Jewish people. It is the Torah itself. And I'll just remind you that today we're talking about Torah and text in the broadest possible sense of the word, so just keep that in mind as we move forward.
I'd like to talk about the shape of Torah. And what I mean by that is the physical presence of Torah in the world. Over time, what does that look like? I should warn you that I am not a Jewish scholar, Torah scholar. I'm not a Jewish educator, so most of what I'm about to say you probably already know. My goal is just to guide our thinking about the context for where we might head by looking at some of the patterns of the past. So, what do we know? Our tradition tells us that the Torah came to us in at least 2 shapes. The written Torah was a fixed sequence of words. Tradition says it was written black fire on white fire, but in a more mundane sense, it was written ink on lambskin. This is an expensive object to produce. It takes a skilled professional a year to create 1 copy of the 5 books of Moses. On the other side, we have the oral Torah. This had no fixed sequence, no fixed set of words. It wasn't written down in any particular way. It exists in between teachers and students, in the voices of the teachings that go face to face. One of the first shifts in the content and the structure of these texts was when a time came that the Jewish people didn't understand their own language well enough. After the first exile, most of the Jewish people were speaking Aramaic, and the Hebrew-only textual tradition became one that started to include Aramaic translations of the text as well. At first, this was not intended to be written down at all, but eventually it was, and these Aramaic translations became part of our textual tradition. So now the shape includes oral Torah, Hebrew Torah, and multilingual Aramaic texts as well. So the redaction of the oral Torah. This is a big shift in the shape of our tradition. The Torah was never meant to be written down in the first place. The Gemara says of itself that if you write down the oral laws, it's as though you've burned the Torah. Yet on the same page of that daf, it says that it's better that we should uproot a single word of Torah than have the entire thing be forgotten. So the fleeting shape of the oral tradition was its downfall. And the shape of that tradition changed when we became comfortable with the fact that we needed to write down the oral tradition or lose it. So now the Mishnah, the Talmud, they are both a fixed set of words that are written down and transmitted. Once we became comfortable with the idea that we could write down our own text, we saw a proliferation of new Torah texts. All of these commentaries, summaries, explication, the thing they have in common is that they're all about the Torah texts that came before. The technology is still scrolls or handwritten manuscripts. They're expensive to produce, they're fragile, they don't travel very well, and yet we start to see an explosion in each generation of new texts. So the printing press, I think we all know, is the big moment in a change of the way in which we disseminate our own knowledge. The cost of production of a printed book was far, far lower than the handwritten copies that came before it. It created a greater sense of accessibility to people who were able to afford works that they weren't able to afford before. For the Jewish people, there's another moment that comes with the advent of printing, which is that we start to see a codification of the sense of intertextuality in our tradition, that we can see visually in the layout of our pages multiple voices speaking to one another. The printing press allowed us to reproduce these complicated layouts in an efficient format. So this brings us to about where we are today, or where we have been so far, where the book is still the dominant way that we transmit the body of the Torah. What are the trends that we've seen so far? Well, for one, Torah texts proliferate. There's not been any time in Jewish history where there was an end of the texts, which we call Torah. Each generation is adding additional layers of text, and those texts are Torah texts by virtue of commenting on, looking back at the text that came before. We also see that the forms of the text move from places that are accessible to smaller groups to places that are accessible to larger groups. We might not always like this trend, not to put a value judgment here, but it is the case that texts that were only in Hebrew before are now in more languages than they were. And an oral tradition that used to exist only in the minds of scholars as they taught to their students is now written down in a form that anyone can go and read. And of course, we've seen that the cost of accessing these texts has decreased at every step of the way. So we know what's coming next. I think everyone in this room came here because you have some sense for the future that we're looking forward to. We're moving into a digital context. Now, might not be able to say everything about where we're going, but there are certain trends to the shape of a digital experience. For one, we know that there's something cheap about the cost of producing and distributing these texts. It's literally the case at this point that if I have a digital text and want to copy and send it to New Zealand, that costs me nothing. I can do that for free. I can do that for free a few thousand times if I want to. Digital texts are also immensely dense. Whereas we had a Beit Midrash before that was lined with thousands of gold spines books, all of those books can now already easily fit within a thumb drive. It's not just a density of storage, though, it's also a density of presentation. A fixed page can't fit more than a handful of commentators in one place. But a mobile, an interactive digital page doesn't have that kind of a limitation. And that brings us to the third point, that it's dynamic. There actually doesn't need to be one particular fixed shape for a Torah text. Any person looking at it might see something different, a different set of voices, a different set of translations, a different context could appear moment by moment because it doesn't have to be produced just one time like a printed book or a scroll of the past. So I've just been describing to you is what the Sefaria project is working on. We are an open source free culture project trying to bring together all of the texts of our tradition in their original and in translation and make them available for anyone to access freely and for others to reuse freely so that new projects can be built upon a shared foundation of digital texts. But I want to close with one point. There's an important distinction to be made between technology and the applications of a technology. Sometimes it's very easy for us to characterize and think about what a technology is like in general, and yet it's extremely difficult to predict in advance what the shape of the applications are that are going to be engaging, successful, and impactful in people's lives. Twitter, I think, is a great example of this. Everyone knew that the internet was a technology for communicating, but when Twitter arrived, it was surprising. It was weird. It didn't really seem to make sense, and yet now hundreds of millions of people are using it on a daily basis. So this is the position we're in with Torah texts going into a digital shape. We know what the basic technology looks like. We know we're going in that direction, but we don't know what the applications are yet. We don't know specifically what form they need to take to be engaging, relevant, and impact people's lives. So how do we find out? Well, I think we're at a good start today, bringing people together, talking about your passions and pains in your experience is a good place to find the ideas for a new kind of application that might be relevant to other people's lives. But ultimately, with new technologies, it's not just about having an idea, it's about experimenting and iterating. Building something once and then throwing it away, building it again, and seeing how people react to it. So I would hope that all of you are spending some time talking to one another about the applications that you wish existed that don't. And if you come up with a good idea, please come talk to me. I'd love to help you build it. Thank you.
So I'm Douglas Rushkoff. I wrote a book called Present Shock. Present shock is really just the human response to living in a world where everything happens now. It's the real-time, always-on existence where we don't really have a past or a future, we don't have an origin or goals. We just have the now. We just have whatever's happening right now. So it's a world in which I think that we're living, or largely living today, one where people don't really join movements with goals. They don't keep their eyes on the prize and work through ends justify the means campaigns towards something, but they just do things kind of for their own sake in the moment, either impatiently in that sort of present shock way, which is kind of what I would critique, that nervous, oh my gosh, I've got to have it right now, or the more mature presentist fashion, which is actually being able to be in the moment, to be able to accept, okay, here we are right now. In some sense, the easiest way to think about it is that we're living way more in RAM than we are on the hard drive, right? In that sort of active memory rather than in a place where we can store things or plan things. And as we move as a culture into this presentist reality and present shocked reality, then the question does become, what happens to the canon? What happens to the sacred? What happens to our text if we're living in the now? And that's a question I think that we as a people and we as a species have been dealing with for a good long time. I mean, the easiest way to think about it for right now is through digital technology, because that's sort of the big shift. That's what we've experienced as the sudden change of this last century. And when digital technology first came around, I thought, I was a slacker at the time, it was the late 80s, I thought, here is going to be a route to more slack, right? That digital technology was going to give us more time, not less. If you remember when we first saw the internet and first saw computers, this meant you could work at home, in your own underwear, on your own schedule, right? We were all just going to live like that. But somehow, when the internet as a culture and as a possibility for more time became the dot-com boom, it became the poster child for the dying NASDAQ stock exchange, all of a sudden human time became the new commodity. Right? We took these devices, and instead of using them in our own time, we strapped them to our bodies and have them ping us every time somebody tweets or sends an email or does a Facebook update, or someone else does a Facebook update with a Facebook update that had your update in it. And we end up living in this kind of state of perpetual emergency interruption that used to be endured only by 911 operators and air traffic controllers. Right? And we get phantom vibration syndrome, where we think the phone's vibrating in our pocket, even though it's actually on a shelf somewhere far away. Right? Where what the possibility of the net was actually to give us more time. If you were on the internet in the early days, the early Usenet days, the days when you got an email, you treated it differently than a phone call, right? Where you realized the phone was ringing, I have to pick it up now, but email just sat there. When you used to get to email in that way in the evening, you're going to look at an email and think, oh my, how do I want to respond to this? You would take an hour or two, and then you'd come and craft. Remember back when you do that? You craft the perfect paragraph response to that, where you sound as clever as Christopher Hitchens or someone. And the internet was a place where we sounded more intelligent than we do in real life. Imagine that. The internet was a place where we sounded smarter than we did in real life because we had all the time in the world to consider. Right, well, what we're really looking at here, I think, is the very ancient dynamic between what the Greeks used to call chronos and kairos. Right, the Greeks had two words for time. Chronos was time of the clock. Right? It's what time is it? What time did you crash the car? 4:01. Right? Kairos is human timing. Right? What time are you going to tell Dad you crashed the car? 4:07? No, it's after he had his drink, before he's opened the bills. Right? That sense of human time, which has nothing to do with the metered time, with the chronology on the clock. Right? The real difference between chronos and kairos, when we get them confused, is when we get in trouble. Right? When we try to lock down and live in chronos and we forget about the power of kairos, of human time. That when I got the idea for this book was when I was watching Real Housewives of Orange County with my wife. And I was trying to figure, I'm a communications theorist, right? I'm a media theorist. So I look at that show and I'm thinking, why are there all these communications breakdowns between these women? And the real reason? It's because they have so much Botox in their face that they can't make appropriate facial expressions to what's happening. Right? So these women, in trying to lock down Chronos at age 29, have made Kairos unavailable to themselves. The moment that they're in is gone, right? The 94% of human communication that happens non-verbally is not accessible to them. Right? Now, this interplay between Chronos and Kairos has been going on since we invented media. That's why I love your media history here. We invent text. Text was the first intrusion of Chronos into Kairos, of what we might call clock time into real time, into human time. Right? Once we had text, what could we have? Once we had text, we could have history, because we could write down what happened, and we can have a future. Now, we could write agreements about the future. Right? The first great documents, the Torah is what? Is basically a contract. If we do this, God will do that. That's what you get. You get accountability into the future, and you get a record of the past. We got the calendar. We got Moshiach, his thing that's coming. With text is how we get that. Right? But once we have a calendar, right, we start to lose track on a certain level of human time, of the time of the heavens. You know, when Hillel made the deal with the Romans, and we kind of went off the lunar clock and into this, we wanted to conform to the Roman year. We start having a calendar now that sort of supersedes what is the time that humans are living in. The next great temporal technology was in the industrial age. Just as when we got the printing press, which of course changed distribution of text, we got the clock. What did the clock do? It broke up the day into all these little pie-shaped units of time. And what did we start doing? We started making money based in time, right? Money that's loaned into existence with a clock in it that has to be paid back at interest. And we started paying people for time instead of the value they created. Now you worked for 3 hours for 3 ducats instead of I'm going to make this thing. So we end up, this is Marx here, but we end up really alienating people from the value they create and exchange with one another, and instead we pay people for time. We punch the clock. Time is money. That's the world we're coming from. Now we're moving into a digital realm. And the effect is just as profound as the invention of text and just as profound as the invention of industry and the clock and the mechanical age. But digital time is different. Right? When you look at a clock and you think about what's a minute is some portion of an hour. An hour is some portion of a day. It has some relationship to the day. When you look at a digital clock, what is it? It's 3:01. It's 3:02. It's 3. I remember when I got my first digital clock, it was the kind with the little things that flap down. Remember those? And I would stare at it and try to count out a minute, and then, right? So a minute just bzzz, a minute is not a portion of an hour or day, a minute is an absolute duration. It's a standalone app, each minute, right? It's presentist. It's just there. It's not like, we're geared, the second hand is moving. We're about halfway through the minute. It's getting up there. Marcel, it's a fresh new minute, right? It's not that. It's just boom, 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 right? That changes everything. And that's where I think what we're dealing with here. That's what we're dealing with when we're talking about authenticity and change and how do people have allegiance to things? How do we continue things? We're shifting from an industrial age society to a presentist one, to a digital one. So what happens on a surface level? What happens is brands and myths and all those things stop having the same kind of value. Right? In the industrial age, we had, industrial agriculture. Ends up becoming the Valley of the Jolly Green Giant, right? And industrial production becomes Keebler elves baking cookies in a hollow tree, right? Brands were created as a way, really, of shielding people from the reality of industrial production. And everybody got involved then in the brand game and the myth game. Brands get their strength from their connection to history. From where did they really come from? Coke, it's the real thing. It comes from them. This is it. This is our brand mythology. It's tied. Its authenticity is where it came from. That's why it's funny when you see the hipster movement now. What is that about? I have all these artifacts from different decades, and that makes me feel real, right? Because they're grounded in some moment in history. Right? But those mythologies, those brands were basically lies. Right? They were invented. But everyone, even religions, end up adopting the industrial age communication system because that's where we're at. And now, of course, every brand out there is concerned because we're moving into a digital realm where values come from the bottom up, where these brands are being deconstructed, where one's connection to history is no longer of value to people in a presentist world, and we start to worry. Well, the only ones that have to worry are people who don't have authenticity beyond that. Right? The Keebler cookies have something to worry about because there's no elves. The Jolly Green Giant has something to worry about because that stuff, I promise you, is not coming from a happy green valley. Right? It's happening in some biotech nightmare that we don't want to know about. Right? So the authenticity of things, certainly of brands, but I would argue of religions, of institutions, of everything now, rather than coming from its origin, is coming from what is it doing now? What's happening now? For the cookie company, it's what's going into those cookies now. Is it organic? Is it not? Are the children of, the little fingers of little Filipino slave children going into the machines? What's happening now? Right? We are moving the possibility of a digital culture that's both so challenging yet so fraught with possibilities, is to move back towards a peer-to-peer live society. Right? The kind of peer-to-peer society that was repressed back in the industrial age, the peer-to-peer bazaar, the marketplace, where people got information from one another rather than from single authorities. Right? In such an environment, the authority of a text, right, is not its historical truth. Right? The authority of a text is its relevance in the now. Right? The authority of a Bible story will be less, did it happen at some moment? Can we prove that the ark was there? Is this a piece of it? Or, much less in that than, are we all on the ark? Are we all making the decision about whether to go on there or not? Are we all Cain right now? Are we all Abel right now? That experience of every time you read Torah, it's like, oh, I get it. This is a story about a kid dealing with his parents. Right? That's what I thought. Now it's just a story about a father dealing with his kids. Every time through, it's a different story. Well, how did that happen? Right? I would argue it happened because it's alive. It's alive and changing. Alive and changing is the biggest fear. That's the biggest threat, if it's alive and changing, right? Because then what do you hang on to? What's real? What's there? What did we lock down? But the possibility in a digital realm is that it's alive and changing, that it's an ongoing conversation. So the text, rather than being valuable for its fixedness, the text, as you saw in that digital app, the text is valuable insofar as it initiates the conversation. Right? This is not a world in which the novel is the central cultural form. This is a world in which the video game is the central cultural form. I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I'm saying it as a thing. It's just true. So a novel dictates this happened, then that happened. We go to a novel for the story. The story happened to somebody else over time and we watch it. When we go to a video game, what are we doing? We're having a real-time, first-person experience where we make choice to choice to choice to choice, where we move through it. The storyteller of a video game is different than the storyteller of a novel, because the storyteller of a novel gets to just tell the story. Storyteller of a video game needs to set up the rules through which the story is told, through which the story is played, through which the story is experienced in real time. The rule set. Now, I would argue as an enthusiastic Jew that the Torah is more than up to this challenge. The Torah has initiated more conversations than you can count. And the rules of engagement are there. We understand what those are. So it's not a threat to Jewish continuity. Right? As I see it, this is Jewish continuity. The Jewish continuity is not about locking something down and somehow preserving this stone over time. That continuity is about keeping this thing alive over time. Or keeping this conversation going like balls in the air, like Tai Chi Chuan, like anything that's real, anything that's in RAM, rather than on the hard drive. In RAM and alive. Oral. They did it with oral. We did it with text. We can do it digitally. We can do it in this age as well. Right? Torah is a living thing. It is not set in stone. Or Botox. And by trying to do so, we end up trapped in that same Housewives of Orange County moment. We end up locked in a moment of the past that has passed and denying ourselves of a real-time living present that's available to us at every single moment. Thekayam. Okay, thank you.
So I want to start this way. Is this question's a kind of funny question about regarding whose Torah is it anyway. And maybe I should use Torah to answer the question first, even though I know we don't do that. Because whose Torah is it anyway is an old anxiety. This is not a new anxiety. And this anxiety goes back. We have texts that when the angels gave, when God gave the Torah, the angels said, don't give the Torah to flesh and blood. They'll mess up the Torah. They'll dilute the Torah. They'll misuse the Torah. They'll pander the Torah, the variety of things that they said. And in that teaching, God says, no. They get the Torah, not you. And the Torah is just to use this language, is simply just another technology. A technology of how to be a human being. Now that we've turned it into tribal fetish is a problem. And if you turn it into tribal fetish, it turns out the only Torah you'll get is fetishized Torah. Okay? But it's an old anxiety. And then we're in the middle of the wandering. Right now, we're in the middle of the wandering, which we're always in the middle of. Why was the Torah given in the desert? Why was the Torah given in the desert? I mean, the fact is, if Torah was alive, this couldn't have been the question of this conference. Whose Torah is it anyway? Was a question that was answered already in the 3rd century. It's everyone's Torah. It's ownerless. That's why it was given in the desert. Already, somebody was trying to shut it down. And that answer was a response to a living question. That teaching of why it was given in the desert was a response to a living question. People wanted to shut it down. People wanted it to stop being dynamic. People wanted to stop living. People wanted to preserve it and control it. In fact, that's the first corporatization of Torah. And the teaching that was taught was that the Torah was given in the desert because it had to be free. In fact, that teaching says it had to be free like bread, that you could never charge for bread and water when a person was hungry. And that was the analogy. Torah had to be free. And the next piece of that text is Torah had to give up ownership of yourself. And if you did, Torah was yours. It's like exactly the opposite of the infrastructure that we've created regarding Jewish education and the rabbit and everything that controls Torah. Exactly the opposite. Which, of course, is why this question is such a funny question. Whose Torah is it anyway? Well, it turns out it's everyone's Torah. So then it's clearly not a question about whose Torah it is. This question is a masked question about the anxiety in this room. And by the way, the anxieties are the major funders of American Jewish life, which I fully understand, because there aren't 10 of them who study any Torah. No, it's not a criticism. You know why? Because they're right. It turns out for most of the modern period in the last 100 years, there was no relationship between the accomplishments of the Jewish people and the study of Torah. So they were right. I left the synagogue rabbinate in teaching Torah in that way for the larger political and philanthropic infrastructure of American Jewish life for 25 years, because the real questions that were being answered were not being answered by people who knew Torah. In fact, the less Torah you knew, the better shot you had of being alive post-Shoah. The less Torah you knew, the better shot you had to get the state of Israel and build it. The less Torah you knew, the better shot you had to deal with the fundamental questions of building a political and philanthropic infrastructure in American Jewish life. Now, it just turns out at some point you have to say, what was the building about? Because if the building is just about building, it's like regulation. It just turns on itself and it becomes complex. And this isn't too big to fail. It's not too big to fail. So let's be honest, more people are studying Torah now than ever in Jewish history. Ever. There's 7,350,000 sites of Torah study when you do Google search Torah study. There are over 60,000 people who study Torah every single day in the state of Israel. Turns out what we're really talking about is not whose Torah is it anyway, but people aren't studying our Torah in this room. And the institutions that mediate that Torah, represented by most of the people in this room, They're weakening. But let's not confuse what's happening to us in our anxiety with Torah in general. Or whose Torah is it? That people aren't studying a certain kind of Torah, but studying a lot of other kind of Torah, from punk Torah to Jews to Jesus Torah. That's a pretty wide range. That's even wider range. I mean, that's really wide. That's first century wide. From punk Torah to Chabad to every possible blog. The question is, what difference does that Torah make? And here's where I want to invite you to think reflectively about what it means to actually teach Torah. And the first thing to ask is, what is the job Torah is supposed to get done? And I don't mean it in a kind of ridiculous or trivial utility. I mean it in my Maimonidean sense, in which Maimonides says, after the entire guide for the perplexed, by the way, he wrote the entire book for one person because the person was perplexed, which basically, now he wouldn't put it this way, but you read the Hakdama, read the introduction, he basically says, this is for one person. This person has a complete college education. He's basically like most American Jews, which we are 2 to 1 relative to other Americans. And he says, in a much nicer way than this, Torah is trivial. It doesn't measure up. It doesn't have anything right to say about the fundamental questions. And that freaked Maimonides out. It took him 10 years to write the book for one person. And he says at the end of the whole book, Kol HaTorah Kula, the entire Torah has only 2 purposes. One is what he calls Tikkun HaNefesh, which he means getting correct opinions about life. What's life really about? What's the truth about life? Who am I in this world? Who am I in this cosmos? Who am I to my wife? Who am I to my friends? Who am I given that I'm going to die? Maybe in 10 minutes. And then he says Tikkun HaGuf, which he doesn't mean repair the body. He means the body politic. How does Torah actually help us develop virtue and character? How does it help us be happy and grateful? How does it help us deal with guilt and jealousy and envy? How does it help us deal with suffering? How does it help us deal with death? How does it help us figure out how to deal with desire? How does it help us love and be just and be... How does it help us understand what it means to be guilty and ashamed? How does it help us be hopeful and optimistic and resilient? How does it help us deal with destruction? And if it does that, Torah is doing its job. Now, it turns out we're using Torah for 2 jobs, basically. 2 or 3 jobs. There's a whole part of the community that uses Torahs Fetish. Let's not worry about them. And by the way, fetish is important too. I'm a pluralist. There's another part of the community, and that's our part, that uses a death spiral metric on Torah. And that Torah is connected to somehow Jewish identity, that if you study Torah, we can measure you as more Jewish. Torah does not belong to the Jewish people. Torah is a wisdom available to everybody on the planet who is searching for meaning and purpose. You don't study Torah to be more Jewish. You study Torah to be more human. You study Torah so the present shock becomes so the present shock becomes a full understanding of the enchantment of the existing moment, which is tied to whatever it is your dream is the future. Torah is actually an antidote to present shock. And that's in many ways a piece of what you were saying at the end. But instead what we have is you study Torah, you get measured as a core Jew. Or you get measured, or we teach Torah so that you'll belong to the Jewish people. It's a kind of attachment mechanism. Well, you know what? It turns out that here's where we are. Most Jews are proud of being Jewish and need no attachment to the Torah that we teach to feel completely Jewish. And that may unnerve us. I mean, it doesn't unnerve me because I actually don't teach in the Jewish community anymore, so it doesn't unnerve me. But it's not about making Jews Jews. And it's not about if your Torah Works is I got them to join and attach. It's not so that the outcomes are like me. And that's the fundamental critique of the philanthropic infrastructure. Just like there's a military-industrial complex that ensures that there's no way to have any military reform, we have the same thing in the philanthropic and Jewish educational rabbinic infrastructure. It's almost impossible to reform, which, by the way, you should worry about. Because the military-industrial complex is very big, but Jewish educators are going to be like journalists. Whose Torah, anyway, is an anxiety about our jobs, your jobs. I don't mean to be not nice, your jobs. And your institutions. And the only response to that is to trust that you have a Torah to teach. Not someone else's Torah, not a Torah that's measured by someone else's metrics of success, but a Torah that actually does help us become alive and awake and able to not simply deal with change, but to be changing. And that's a big, 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 big shift. What job is Torah getting done for you? There's no such thing as Torah in general. There's the Torah that people and you need at the moment. What Torah do you need? What Torah does the country need? What Torah do we need about governing and about science and about politics and about love? What Torah do we need? We couldn't even, whose Torah anyway is answered? We couldn't even answer that from our own Torah, our own group. What authenticity is when there's a genuine living question to which Torah actually responds. For us, what is the living question in your life and in our lives of Korach? What's the living question of the Meraglim? What's the living question of Churban? If you don't know what the question is, we don't know what the Torah is. The Torah is designed around real questions. And it either surfaces questions or you have to discover the question. But if you don't have the right question, Torah is just flat. It's like flatlining Torah. And it makes no difference. And here's something that we do that we have to stop doing regarding Torah. We either use Torah to legitimate and anchor our psychological and political predispositions. That is not teaching Torah. I don't know what that is. That's basically politics and, that's politics and drag. What is that? I travel so much around the country. You tell me the rabbi, I'll tell you their Torah. That's terrible. You tell me their politics, I'll tell you the Torah. If you're a right-wing person in Israel, I know what your Torah is about it. I know how you understand Chayei Sarah. I know how you understand Vayera. If you're liberal, you'll love Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you're traditional, you'll love Abraham at the Akedah. Big deal. Big deal. The question is not just how to Torah anchor and root and stabilize and legitimate and cheerlead. It's like Torah is cheerleading to what we already believe. But it's how does Torah destabilize? How does Torah transform, not translate? How does Torah open up? How does Torah allow us to hear the dissent, internally and externally? And by the way, if we want to use Torah to just affirm the culture, I'm all for that too, but at least let's know who we are in the drama. That's the most important thing. Who are we in the drama of this? So what's the job to get done? And who are we teaching? I'm not against a tweet of Torah. A tweet of Torah that gets the job done, I'm all for it. Just know the tweet of Torah is different than a shiur, and a shiur is different than a sermon on Rosh Hashanah, and a sermon on Rosh Hashanah is different than teaching seventh graders going into puberty. And I'm okay for I don't care about the form. All I care is that it works. And getting caught up in the form, as opposed to understanding what's the unbelievable opportunity this method, this form, this technology allows. That's the only question. Now you have to be smart about it. If you tweet your Yom Kippur sermon, you'll be fired. And there's a difference between a blog and a book. A book's harder to write. It takes longer. There's more distractions, you know? But as long as we know what, and being on the Today Show is different than being on Shalom TV. And doing a film is different than writing a book that you want in a Jewish library. So who are we actually teaching? What's the living question of that community? And what Torah do we have to teach? So here are the things. Or another way of putting this is, does Torah actually help us flourish as human beings? If Torah helps us flourish, then every possible technology that allows us to both create, curate, collaborate, every technology is unbelievable and an amazing gift. If we actually have a Torah to teach. So here's the piece. Because we're right near ground zero. And it turns out that we had nothing to say. I also think 9/11 was a really, really, really changing moment, along with December 31st, 1999, if you've read Douglas's book. And I think, and this is again just my Torah, that the fact that the only Torah the Jewish people had in America to teach that was public, and I did an exhaustive on all public media, was that now Americans know that we're Israelis. It was profoundly understandable and even more profoundly pathological. That a people that understands Churban had nothing to say to America. So I'm going to need just 40 seconds more. It turned out I had two friends who died right there, including somebody that I had married just a few months before. And if you were living in the city, there was dust on the windows, which was, it's one thing to, bullshit around and say from dust to dust. It's another thing to recognize it's true. And so I found myself kind of becoming like George Bush, angry and fearful and resentful and revengeful, all really, really, really important parts of the human experience. But it turns out you don't want to build policy on that or build your life on that. So one day I was reading the New York Times, and I saw there were cell phone conversations that we were able to record because we had tremendous new technology. It was amazing. A person could call from the 86th floor, leave a message on a cell phone, the person could be dead, and we could have that message forever. And that blew me away. So I started collecting them, started reading them, and here's the weird thing. There wasn't one final cell phone conversation that was hateful. Not one. That in the dearness of the vanishing moment, as Allen Ginsberg said, not one in the dearness of the vanishing moment, not one that wasn't filled with love and affection, that wasn't filled with care and connection. And I was blown away that people, just as they were being blown up, could be so filled with love. And me, who had lived, still in my apartment, how is it that I was becoming so angry and resentful? And so I started reading those final cell phone conversations every morning. And then one day, I started to chant them. It wound up being on television the day after, and that's on PBS yet, not prime, not major network. I had about 10,000 emails within 24 hours. And they all started the same way. I'm not Jewish, but. In fact, the vast majority of ones from Jews weren't so pretty. So here they are. Honey, something terrible is happening. I don't think I'm going to make it. I love you. Take care of the children. Mommy, the building is on fire. This is a 28-year-old from Brooklyn. There's smoke coming through the walls. I can't breathe. I love you, Mommy. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
I appreciate the opportunity to be calm and quiet, particularly after hearing Eicha chanted in quite that way, which will undoubtedly not be the same for me in coming commemorations of the ninth day of Av. I was hungry for examples throughout your teaching about how Torah destabilizes us and opens us up. And the example that you gave in clear illustration was a very dramatic one. And I'm thinking about, where does Torah destabilize us or open us for us in a much more mundane parts of our lives?
Pick any area. And, so you want to say relationships. So we have a culture in which there's incredible amounts of divorce and marriage are polarized. Well, it turns out that that's an interesting way to look at things, and if you wind up with divorce and marriage polarized, you wind up with lawyers making millions and millions of dollars in adversarial stuff. But if you actually imagine that divorce is as sacred as marriage, then you begin to understand, there's a new way to conceptualize that. Take any issue in the public square. Every issue in the public square is dualized right now. Every single one. It doesn't matter. Gun control, immigration, etc. Liberals will take one position. Conservatives will take another position. I actually don't care. I have my own political positions on it. But what Torah can do is it can help you see the partial truth of the other side. And when you see the partial truth of the other side, it may only be partial, but it changes your take. So it's on every single issue that I think it works this way: is whatever your predisposition is on anything. I don't care what it is, If it's parenting, then, or if you're an orderly person, well, transgression is absolutely necessary. So the question is, if you like transgression, then it's, where is order? And it's about looking at texts. Again, this is a methodology of text, about looking at texts and not locating in the text what you agree with and what affirms you, but locating in the text if you're going to go that way, if you're going to start with the text. Otherwise, you have to start with life first. You have to find a real question. Whatever your real question is, you have to, what I call, you have to roll the text, you have to hypertext, and you have to see, what is a real question to you. The issue is the authenticity piece. Right now, we teach like this. Most Jewish education happens this way, right? And you can't teach that way. You have to teach this way. And so it's on everything. So it doesn't matter. It's Korach. So we'll have half the sermons on Korach will be Korach was terrible, and half the teaching on Korach will be somehow Korach was great because he saw equality before anyone else. And you'll have those two things, but that's not the point, right? Whichever point you agree with, Torah is teaching the opposite to you. Because it turns out that the same Korach that you hate, his children, you're saying on a practice once a week, Korach. So the transgression and the rebellion is actually part of who you are as much as being swallowed up by the rebellion. So it's a methodology regarding, that's where the authenticity comes. Otherwise, Torah is not important. People don't need Torah. They don't need Torah. They don't need Torah to be Jewish. They surely don't need Torah to be human unless it actually adds value.
You talked about rules of engagement. You talked about about how we engage with video games in an interactive way, and then you made a statement. You said we have rules of engagement about Torah, and we all know what those are. And I don't know what you mean. So I actually would love to hear more about the rules of engagement with Torah and how that, again, that brings us maybe out of present shock.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at the rules of engagement with Torah, and when they're not followed, how people go crazy. Like one rule, maybe I got these orally, and maybe they're not real rules, but they're my rules. That you're not really supposed to study Torah alone. That you're supposed to study with a midrash of 9 other people who will disagree with you.
That's the version, right? Exactly.
Right. Why that? If you have 9 people who are going to disagree with you, first it makes you realize that you don't have the right answer, right? Second, if you're going to do the thing that he was saying that people do, where you go, Abraham does this, therefore we should go to war, there's going to be someone else who go, well, no, Abraham did this, so you shouldn't go to war. So there'll be that other person. And it enforces community. So now you're understanding that Torah is not this sort of solo ego trip thing, but it's something that has to be the entrance to a conversation or it doesn't count. Right? And when you don't do that, you end up in those sort of Shabbatai V moments. When Jews go crazy is when they're sitting alone in their attics studying and they go nuts. So it's sort of that it's to get around the table, at least where I come from, you got to be 13 years old. You got to prove that you stand up in front of your congregation and you demonstrate you've got basic literacy, that you can speak intelligently about this parsha, and then they go, okay, now you can sit with these old guys and argue at the table with us. So all of that is, to me, is set up much more sort of like, I don't mean it's like a video game, but it's more about a game that you play, more
It's
like
alive,
like an FRP, a fantasy role-playing game, than it is like some novel that you're reading to get to the end and find out what happened.
Or reading because now you are a good boy, or a good Jew, or you're measured out as core Jew. In other words, that's why the rules of engagement, and there's a lot of them like that, are become so important. I think, could you imagine if we told Democrats and Republicans that there's this ancient wisdom tradition that suggests that if actually you want to build a good society, you're not allowed to study public policy alone. Now it's about wisdom that actually helps people flourish in their lives. It's not about group attachment and kind of scoring Jewish. And that's the shift we're going to have to make. And in this world, we're really going to have to make it, because it turns out over 90% of American Jews score out proud to be Jewish. But less than 25% of Jews say that Torah is even important to be Jewish. So it turns out they've decided you don't need Torah you don't need any Torah. And actually, they're actually very Jewish in that respect, because this whole notion of how important Torah is relatively new. Most people are illiterate. Okay? Most people are literate for most of human history. They didn't know Torah. So we're in a highly literate society now, so we're going to need an upgrade. But it's going to have to, that's those rules of engagement. It'd be good to put down a few of them, even if we wind up transgressing them.
There have been a number of questions in terms of the role of the teacher, about bridging these gaps, about helping people find the texts, about navigating this and going through the heart, not the head. A lot of things that sound beautiful and wise, and sort of bringing it down very practically in terms of how we're relating. And I, of course, had a question about God, but we have 1 minute. How come God gets squeezed into the last minute? I don't know. But one part of my question is where how we relate to God within present shock. So that's a big question. But maybe if you want to go to that, and then you want to go to the how we actually teach it, and then we're done.
I mean,
God in present shock.
God in present shock, and the easiest way to say that part would be that if we value God, it is less for having created this world at some moment in the past, but rather for creating it in the present in an ongoing way.
Okay.
By that. Or for the future even, or for what God's going to do someday in the future. It's right, it's just happening now. It's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is we're in a shift. In other words,
right.
the way in which we teach Torah in general, it's bad metaphysics and worse theology, and so a lot of people can't even get into the conversation. So that's a separate. I don't care what you believe in God, and show me how you behave, and I'll tell you the God you believe in. So it's the opposite. We argue God into existence. We don't believe in God. We have trust in the way the world could be. We don't believe in God. All these things are such Protestant, kinds of categories that we assimilated. So it's not helpful. In terms of the teacher, it's always the same. When you have to teach from an authentic place. It's not rocket science. Everybody knows this. From the student's perspective. When you're ready, you'll always find the right teacher. Yeah. A piece of grass can be, the right teacher, so we'll always find the right teacher. Now, on the other hand, for teachers, they have to have the right questions, and it's really the right questions. It's listening very carefully to what is the question of the moment, and if that question of the moment is completely disconnected from your own psychospiritual and psychosocial world, the possibility of you finding any sort of resource from the wisdom tradition to help people is very, very slim.
It's funny, in present shock, I make a strong argument on why you should never do this, or you should never have, because this is what I call digiphrenia.
Digiphrenia.
It's when you actually are having your attention in more than one place at the same time. It devalues, nothing again, I don't feel insulted, it's fine. It devalues the sanctity of real bodies and space together. We're saying that this moment is less important than that.
Well, because it's not, I think that's really interesting. I think it may be, again, I'm not against anything in its place, but it may be that you can't actually multitask and read Plato, that you can't multitask and study Torah, and that is one of the places where you don't multitask. You're doing enough multitasking internally, independent of the external multitasks that you have to do. And that would be interesting new rules of regulation. And it's not because it's a don't, there's always do's and don'ts. You always have to develop a halacha for the moment, right? And that halacha, as you build the halacha melts away. So it's okay, but you have to know that you're doing that. And so you would say, you can't multitask and do wisdom. You can do multitask and do other things.
You can't actually multitask. There's no such thing.
You can't do multitask.
You can't.
Okay.
Turns out,
Good.
human
Good.
consciousness is one-pointed. It just is. It just is. You can switch back. You can go
switch
back and forth. You
quickly.
can go back and forth
Right.
between lots of things. Yeah.
So
Great.
clearly we could keep talking. What I'm struck by is the notion of fit, finding a text that fits, finding resources that fit, finding authenticity and identity that fit with where we are at the moment. I like the idea that at any one moment I might find a different Torah that speaks to who I am. I really have this analogy in my head, forgive me, of we've had a lot of male analogies about fathers and sons and bar mitzvahs, and I gotta tell you that I am right to where I tried on the 15th wedding dress and I didn't take it off. There was a fit. I know this is deeply shallow, and yet at the same time, it was deeply spiritual. And there is just a notion of, we see this when we connect with people, when we connect with memories, very much spoke to me about this notion of trying to be actually present and focused and be able to look each other in the eye as opposed to looking here and there all at the same time. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.